66 years old, Elena Vance sat in a cold vinyl chair while the final drops of chemotherapy entered her vein. But what her ex-husband Julian didn't know, what he was too busy calculating to see, was that a woman who has survived the edge of life is no longer afraid of a ruin. This is the story of how a discarded deed to a cursed sanatorium became a beacon of justice that would change medical history forever. If you've ever felt like your years of service were erased in a single legal meeting, if you've been told you are too old to start over while fighting for your very breath, if you've ever held a piece of paper that was supposed to be your ending but felt like a beginning, then you need to hear what happened next. Subscribe now, because the moment Elena stepped onto that mist-covered moor, the universe began to settle a debt 30 years in the making. Elena Vance had spent 30 years as the invisible architecture of someone else's success. Before the diagnosis and the divorce, she had been a surgical nurse with hands that never shook. She gave up her position at the hospital when Julian said his legal practice needed a manager he could trust. She traded her scrubs for sensible wool skirts and spent 3 decades balancing ledgers at her kitchen table long after the house went dark. She never drew a salary. When Julian needed the capital for his partnership buy-in, she signed the papers to sell the lakeside cottage she had inherited from her grandfather. She watched the new owners paint over the height marks of her children on the kitchen door frame, and she did not complain. For 5 years, she was the one who woke at 3 in the morning to turn Julian's bedridden mother so she wouldn't develop sores. She crushed the pills and sang the old hymns while Julian stayed late at the office, building a reputation for being the most available attorney in the city. Elena was the foundation he never bothered to inspect. Her daily life before the fall was a rhythm of quiet service. She would wake at 5 to prepare Julian's coffee and review the day's filings. She knew every client's name and every deadline. She kept a small silver pillbox in her pocket, a gift from her nursing mentor in 1980. The engraved caduceus on the lid was worn smooth by her thumb. It was the only thing she carried that belonged entirely to her. She would touch it whenever the fatigue threatened to pull her under. It reminded her of who she was before she became a wife and a manager. It reminded her of the woman who knew how to heal. The divorce meeting took place in a room that smelled of expensive floor wax and recycled air. The light from the floor-to-ceiling windows made the mahogany table look like a sheet of ice. Julian did not look at her face. He spent most of the hour adjusting the gold link of his left cuff and checking the time on his phone. He had a new associate with him, a woman in her late 20s who took notes with a silver pen. When it came time to discuss the moorland property, Julian pushed a single sheet of paper across the table with his index finger. He acted as if the document might leave a physical stain on his hand. He told the room that the property was a gesture of concern. He said it would provide her with the fresh air and peace she needed for her recovery. The moorland sanatorium to Elena, the suburban estate to Julian, the investment portfolios to Julian, the legal practice to Julian. While he exchanged a brief, efficient nod with his associate, Elena received what he called her quiet retreat. It was a deed to Street Jude's, an abandoned stone structure on the northern moors that hadn't seen a patient since the 1970s. Julian's father had bought it for the land value, but the local council had frozen all development decades ago. To Julian, it was a tax liability he was finally shedding. He called it a clean break. He told her she should be grateful he was being so practical about her future. Elena did not cry. She did not ask him why 30 years of marriage were worth a pile of haunted granite in a place where the wind never stopped. She reached into her pocket and gripped the silver pillbox until the metal bit into her palm. She looked at the deed. She looked at the man who had decided she was a spent resource. She thought about the 4 cycles of chemotherapy she had endured alone while he was traveling for business. "Is that all?" she asked. Her voice was thin, but it did not waver. Julian stood up and buttoned his jacket. He told her that he had already arranged for a car to take her personal items to a storage unit. He said he was being more than fair given the circumstances. He told her she was lucky he wasn't making this harder than it needed to be. He walked out of the room without looking back. The door clicked shut with a sound that felt final. Elena sat in the silence of the law office and realized she had no home to return to. She had a silver pillbox, a deed to a ruin, and a body that was tired of being strong for people who didn't care. She didn't look back. Elena stood on the gravel lot of the all-safe storage facility. The sun was a pale, heatless disk behind the city smog. She had 2 suitcases at her feet. One held her clothes and a few sweaters. The other held the medical textbooks she couldn't bring herself to sell. Her joints throbbed with the deep, ringing ache that chemotherapy leaves in the marrow. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen. It was bright and indifferent. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from her children. There were no messages from the friends she had hosted for 30 years. The last notification was an automated alert from the hospital pharmacy. It told her that her prescription for anti-nausea medication was ready for pickup. She knew she could no longer afford the copay. She swiped the notification away, and the screen went black. She opened her banking app one last time. The number on the screen did not change, no matter how long she stared at it. She had $48.62 in her checking account. Julian had ensured the joint accounts were frozen the morning the papers were filed. He had told the judge it was a necessary step to prevent the dissipation of marital assets. Elena looked at her hands. They were thin, and the skin looked like translucent parchment. These were the hands that had built his law practice and raised his family. Now they held $48.62. She felt a phantom weight in her right pocket. She reached in and touched the silver pillbox. The cold metal felt like an anchor. It was the only thing Julian hadn't been able to take from her. The storage unit was a 5x5 metal box. It smelled of industrial cleaner and old dust. She had spent the afternoon watching 3 men in grey uniforms stack 30 years of her life into a corner. They moved her grandmother's hand-carved chair with a casual shrug. They tossed the boxes of Christmas ornaments on top of the heavy filing cabinets. They did not care about the labels she had written in neat, nursing school script. To them, it was just cubic footage. To Elena, it was the sound of her life being compressed into a dark box. When they finished, the lead mover handed her a small brass key. He did not look her in the eye. He just pointed toward the exit. She sat on her suitcase for a long time. The hallway of the storage facility was lit by motion sensor lights. When she sat still, the lights clicked off. She sat in the absolute darkness and listened to the hum of the ventilation system. She thought about the bridge under the highway. She thought about the shelter downtown. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the deed Julian had given her. Street Jude's sanatorium. It was 4 hours away by bus. The ticket would cost $32. That would leave her with $16.62. It was a choice between a slow disappearance in the city or a fast one on the moors. She stood up. Her knees clicked and a sharp pain shot through her hip. She ignored it. She dragged her suitcases toward the heavy metal door of the facility. The wheels of the bags made a hollow, rattling sound on the concrete floors. She reached the bus station just as the sky was turning a bruised purple. The terminal was filled with people moving toward lives that still had shapes and destinations. She stood in line behind a man with a heavy rucksack. When she reached the counter, she pushed her $32 through the glass. The clerk handed her a one-way ticket to Blackwood Cross. It was the stop nearest the moor. She waited on a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by 1,000 tired travelers. She pulled the silver pillbox out and turned it over in her hands. The caduceus caught the flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights. She opened the lid. It was empty. She hadn't been able to afford the last round of supplemental vitamins. She closed the lid with a sharp snap. She wouldn't be needing pills where she was going. She would be needing a roof. The bus pulled into the bay with a hiss of air brakes. It smelled of diesel fumes and wet wool. Elena climbed the steps. She did not look at the other passengers. She found a seat in the back and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The city began to slide away. The lights of the skyscrapers looked like distant, uncaring stars. She was alone. The bus dropped her off at a gravel crossroads under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind came off the moor with a steady, low-frequency hum. Blackwood Cross consisted of 4 buildings and a single flashing yellow light. Elena stood on the edge of the road with her 2 suitcases. Her chest felt tight. Every breath was a reminder of the toxins still clearing from her system. She looked toward the general store. It had a faded blue awning that flapped in the wind like a broken wing. The window was framed by checkered red curtains that had been bleached pink by the sun. She dragged her bags across the street. The bell above the door chimed with a thin, metallic ring. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, sharp cheddar, and damp wool. A woman with iron-gray hair was stocking jars of honey on a shelf. She didn't look up when the door opened. She waited until the bell stopped vibrating. "The bus is usually 6 minutes late on Tuesdays," the woman said. She turned around. Her eyes were sharp behind thick glasses. She looked at Elena's suitcases. Then she looked at Elena's face. She didn't ask for a name. She didn't ask why a woman in a city coat was standing in a town that most people forgot to mark on a map. "You're Elena Vance," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Elena gripped the handle of her bag. She felt the silver pillbox shift in her pocket. "How do you know who I am?" The woman leaned against the counter. "Arthur told us to watch for a woman who looks like she's carrying the weight of a stone wall. He said you'd have a silver box and eyes that have seen too much of the inside of a hospital. We've been waiting for you, Elena." The woman reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy iron key tied to a piece of frayed twine. She pushed it across the wood. She said that Arthur had been keeping the perimeter fences upright for 50 years. She said he was up at the trailer now, waiting for the smoke from the chimney. Elena took the key. It felt heavier than her suitcase. She asked for a bottle of water and a loaf of bread. The woman shook her head. She put the items in a brown paper bag and pushed them toward Elena. She told her she could pay when the first garden bloomed. Elena walked out into the gathering mist. The road turned from asphalt to packed dirt, and then to a narrow track of crushed stone. The moor rose up on either side of her, a vast expanse of purple heather and grey rock. The wind grew colder. It smelled of ancient rain and damp earth. She walked for 2 miles. Her feet were numb. Her lower back felt like it was being compressed by a vice. Then she saw it. Street Jude's sanatorium sat on a rise like a granite corpse. It was a massive, 4-story structure of grey stone and rusted iron. The roof had collapsed in the west wing. Vines thicker than a man's arm moved up the walls. It didn't look like a retreat. It looked like a warning. The windows were dark sockets. The silence surrounding the building was absolute. It was worse than Julian had described. He had called it a ruin to be modest. In reality, it was a graveyard for forgotten hopes. Elena reached the main entrance. A set of heavy oak doors sat beneath a crumbling stone arch. She looked up. High above the lintel was a carved stone angel. Its wings had been sheared off by decades of storms. Its face was worn smooth by the wind. But the angel's hands were still pressed together in a gesture of absolute stillness. Elena took the iron key from her pocket. Her hand trembled as she fit it into the lock. The metal screamed as it turned. The door did not swing open. She had to put her shoulder against the wood. The air that rushed out of the building was cold and smelled of floor wax and 60 years of dust. She stepped into the darkness of the foyer. The door groaned shut behind her. Elena stood in the center of the grand foyer. The ceiling rose 30 feet into a darkness that smelled of wet lime and ancient soot. A grand staircase of marble and wrought iron curved upward into the shadows. Half of the banister had been stripped away. Pieces of the ornate plaster molding lay on the floor like shattered bone. She did not move for a long time. The sound of her own breathing was the only thing filling the massive, empty space. It was a hollow, wet sound that reminded her of the hospital corridors she had just escaped. She dragged her suitcases to the bottom step of the staircase. She sat on the edge of the larger one. Her knees were swollen and hot. The cold from the stone floor began to seep through the soles of her shoes. She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. It was a slim leather thing Julian had bought her for their 25th anniversary. She opened it and pulled out the remaining cash. 1 $10 bill, 1 $5 bill, 1 single. Then she reached into the small coin pouch. She counted the change on her lap. 6 dimes, 2 pennies, $16.62. That was the total value of Elena Vance in the eyes of the world. It was not enough for a taxi back to the station. It was not enough for a hotel room in the next town. It was exactly enough to buy 3 more loaves of bread and perhaps a jar of peanut butter. She stared at the coins until they blurred into copper and silver streaks. She realized she was waiting for a sound. She was waiting for the chime of a doorbell or the vibration of a phone. She pulled the device from her pocket. The battery was at 12%. There were no new notifications. The call log showed the last outgoing call was to Julian's office 3 weeks ago. It had lasted 40 seconds. His secretary had told her he was in a deposition. The inbox was a graveyard of medical appointments and insurance denials. No one was coming to check on the woman in the stone house. No one was wondering if she had survived the bus ride or the walk across the moor. The silence was a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She reached into her coat pocket and found the silver pillbox. She pulled it out and held it in the center of her palm. The engraved caduceus was the only bright thing in the room. She remembered the day she received it. Her mentor had told her that a good nurse always carries her own strength. Elena rubbed her thumb across the worn metal. She thought about the city. She thought about the life she had built there. It was gone as surely as the roof on the west wing. There was no going back to a place that had already erased her name. A gust of wind caught the heavy oak doors. They groaned on their hinges, but the iron bolt held. Elena looked up the staircase. The darkness felt thick, like velvet. She could hear the rhythmic drip of water hitting a metal bucket somewhere deep in the building. It was a steady, clinical sound. It reminded her of an IV drip. She stood up. Her back flared with a sharp, stabbing pain. She leaned against the marble newel post until the world stopped spinning. She would not go back to the crossroads. She would not sit on the gravel and wait for a bus that would take her to a shelter. She picked up her suitcases. The weight felt different now. It was no longer a burden. It was her entire world. She began to walk away from the door. She moved toward the sound of the dripping water. Each step echoed against the stone walls. The sound was loud and deliberate. She was still here. Her heart was still beating. She kept walking. Elena pushed open a heavy door at the end of the first-floor hallway. It was a small office with a desk of dark oak and a single window facing the moor. The glass was cracked but mostly intact. She dragged her suitcases inside and leaned against the wood. The room smelled of old paper and the sharp, medicinal scent of eucalyptus that had survived for 50 years. Her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing heat. Her fingers felt like thick, frozen twigs as she tried to unbutton her wool coat. She did not have the strength to open her bags. She lay down on the floor behind the desk to block the draft from the door. The stone was unforgiving. It felt like the cold was reaching through her skin to touch the bones that had been weakened by the hospital treatments. She woke to the sound of a heavy engine idling outside. A beam of light cut through the dust in the office and hit the far wall. Elena sat up. Her joints screamed. She grabbed the edge of the desk and pulled herself to her feet. Her knees made a dry, clicking sound in the silence. She moved to the window. A rusted white truck was parked near the stone archway. A man in a heavy canvas coat was unloading a stack of wood. He moved with a slow, deliberate limp. Elena walked to the main doors. She had to use the weight of her entire body to force the oak open. The morning air was sharp and tasted of salt. The man stopped moving when he heard the door groan. He was tall with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the sanatorium. He had white hair tucked under a grease-stained cap. He did not smile. He did not ask her for identification. "I'm Arthur," he said. His voice was a low growl that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I live in the trailer by the south fence. I kept the wood dry for whenever you decided to show up." Elena looked at the pile of oak logs. "Julian said the property was abandoned." Arthur spat on the gravel. "Julian hasn't been here since he was 10 years old. His father didn't care about this place. But my father was the pharmacist here until the day they chained the gates. Someone had to keep the walls from falling down." Arthur picked up 2 heavy logs and walked toward the entrance. He didn't wait for her to invite him in. He walked past her into the foyer and set the wood down near a small stone fireplace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a box of matches and a small bundle of dry kindling. He knelt on the stone. His movements were practiced. Within minutes, a small orange flame was licking at the oak. The smell of wood smoke began to push back the scent of rot. "There's a hand pump in the kitchen," Arthur said. He stood up and brushed the bark from his sleeves. "The water comes from a deep spring. It's cold and it tastes like iron. Drink it. It's better for you than anything they give you in those plastic bags at the clinic." He looked at Elena's thin neck and the way her coat hung off her shoulders. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. He set it on the mantelpiece. "My daughter makes salve from the heather. It helps with the joint rot. Use it twice a day." Elena reached out to touch the tin. "I don't have any way to pay you, Arthur." Arthur looked at the silver pill box she was holding. He nodded once. "You've got the box. That's enough for now. My father said the woman who carried that would be the one to finally open the dispensary. I'll be back tomorrow with a ladder." He walked out before she could ask him what he meant. Elena stood by the fire. The heat felt like a miracle. She pulled the tin of salve toward her and opened the lid. It smelled of earth and crushed flowers. She sat on the floor and pulled up the legs of her trousers. Her knees were swollen and purple. She began to rub the green paste into her skin. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened. It became a dull hum instead of a jagged scream. For the next 3 days, Elena built a routine. She woke, when the light hit the stone angel outside. She pumped water until her arms burned and her palms were raw. She scrubbed the floor of the office. She scrubbed the floor with a piece of burlap and the iron-rich water. She ate 2 slices of the bread she had bought at the crossroads. She counted her remaining money every night, $16.62. It was a small, steady number. She spent hours walking the corridors. She found the old patient wards. She found the laundry with its massive copper vats. She found the chapel with its broken stained glass. She moved slowly. She had to stop every 10 minutes to let her heart stop racing. She used a discarded broom handle as a cane. On the 4th night, the wind picked up. It howled through the broken windows of the West Wing like a choir of ghosts. Elena sat by her small fire in the office. She looked at her phone. The battery was dead. It was a black mirror that showed her nothing but her own tired reflection. She realized she had stopped checking it for messages. The silence of the moor was different from the silence of the city. In the city, she was ignored. On the moor, she was simply part of the landscape. She pulled the silver pillbox from her pocket. She opened it and looked at the empty velvet lining. She thought about Julian's face in the law office. She thought about the way he had checked his watch while she was signing away her life. She realized she didn't hate him. Hate required an energy she didn't possess. She felt a strange, cold clarity. He had given her a ruin because he thought she was a ruin. He thought they would both crumble into the heather together. She stood up and walked to the wall behind the desk. She had noticed a leak there earlier in the day. The water wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was seeping out from behind a heavy wood panel. She touched the wood. It felt soft. She picked up a heavy glass paperweight from the desk and struck the panel. The wood splintered. Behind it was not stone, but a heavy iron door with a brass dial. The dampness of the stone began to colonize Elena's lungs by the end of the first week. Every breath felt like pulling heavy, wet wool through a narrow straw. She spent the mornings gathering rainwater in cracked porcelain basins she had found in the upper wards. Her hands were raw, and the skin over her knuckles had split into jagged red lines. She did not have bandages. She used strips of a clean silk scarf to wrap her fingers so she could continue to turn the heavy iron handle of the kitchen pump. Her knees were swollen to the size of grapefruits. She had to crawl up the 3 steps to the office on her hands and shins because her joints refused to lock. The pain was not a metaphor. It was a sharp, white heat that lived in her patellas and moved into her hips with every movement. She sat on the floor of the office and looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Her face was a landscape of shadows. She looked like a woman who had already been buried and forgotten. She reached for her phone, but it was a cold, dead weight. She hadn't been able to find a working outlet that hadn't been chewed through by mice. There were no messages waiting for her. There was no one in the city wondering if the chemotherapy side effects had finally stopped. There was only the sound of the wind moving through the heather and the rhythmic drip of water into a bucket. She thought about her remaining $16.62. It was a specific, terrifying number. It was the price of 4 more loaves of bread and a single jar of jam. It was not enough to fix the hole in the roof above the dispensary. It was not enough to buy the coal she would need when the real frost arrived. The math was too large to look at directly. She realized she was waiting for the end. She was waiting for her body to decide it had done enough. "I cannot fix a leaky roof," she said aloud. The sound of her own voice was startling in the empty room. "I am 66 years old with $16, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." She lay back on the thin rug and closed her eyes. She thought, "This is where I die. Not tonight, but soon. This is what it looks like when a life is subtracted until there is nothing left but the stone." She felt the cold of the floor rising to meet her spine. She considered letting the fire go out. She considered stopping the water pump. It would be quiet. It would be easier than crawling. The fire in the hearth shifted. A single ember popped and landed near her hand. Elena opened her eyes. The light from the dying flame caught the edge of the silver pillbox sitting on the desk. The engraved caduceus glowed with a sudden, fierce orange light. It looked like a spark of life in a room full of shadows. She reached up and touched the cool metal. She felt the weight of the silver. It was a small thing, but it was solid. It was the only thing Julian hadn't been able to break. She thought about the iron door she had found behind the panel. She thought about Arthur's father and the woman with the silver box. She wasn't a ruin. She was a nurse. She knew that a patient didn't die until the heart stopped. Her heart was still beating. It was slow and tired, but it was beating. She rolled onto her side and gripped the edge of the desk. She pulled herself up. Her hip gave a sharp, sickening pop. She gritted her teeth until she tasted copper. She would not die on the floor because a man in a mahogany office decided she wasn't worth the space. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth. She limped toward the wood paneling. "I'm not finished," she whispered. She struck the iron door with the poker. The sound was a deep, resonant chime that echoed through the entire skeleton of the sanatorium. It was the sound of a bell. She struck it again. The vibration moved up her arm and into her chest. It felt like her own pulse returning to her. She began to scrape the rust away from the brass dial. Her fingers bled, but she did not stop. She had $16.62 and a silver box. It was enough. The iron door did not want to move. Elena braced her feet against the uneven stone floor and pulled the handle with both hands. Her shoulders burned. The internal stitches from her surgery felt like they were pulling tight against her ribs. She stopped to breathe. The air in the small office was cold and smelled of the dying oak fire. She looked at her hands. They were shaking so violently she had to tuck them under her armpits to make them stop. She picked up the iron poker again. She began to chip away at the calcified lime that had sealed the edges of the door. Every strike sent a jarring shock through her elbows. She worked in the dark, guided only by the flickering orange light from the hearth. It took an hour to clear the seam. She reached for the brass dial. It was cold. She turned it to the right. It moved a fraction of an inch and stopped. She turned it to the left. A heavy internal bolt clicked. Elena pulled. The door groaned, a long, high-pitched scream of metal on metal. It swung open 6 inches and hit a pile of debris on the other side. She dropped the poker. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pillbox. She gripped it for a moment, letting the cool weight steady her. Then she squeezed through the gap. She was standing in a room that had not felt a human footfall in 50 years. It was the inner dispensary vault. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves made of dark, lead-lined wood. Hundreds of amber glass bottles sat in neat rows, their labels yellowed and curling like dead leaves. The air was dry. It smelled of ozone, dried lavender, and something sharp and chemical. Elena moved toward a small desk in the center of the room. Her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. It wasn't the exertion. It was the weight of the silence. She saw a heavy, leather-bound book lying open on the blotter. Next to it was a fountain pen, its nib dried and crusted with blue ink. It looked as if the person sitting there had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. She reached out and touched the cover of the book. The leather was soft, like skin. She saw a symbol embossed in the center of the leather. It was a caduceus, identical to the one on her silver pillbox. She pulled the box from her pocket and set it down on the desk. The silver matched the scale of the engraving. Her hands were still trembling as she turned the first page. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script. Clinical Trials. Protocol 74B. Dr. Aris Thorne. Elena sat in the heavy wooden chair. She began to read. She was a surgical nurse. She knew the language of the body. She knew the Latin names for the lungs and the complex chemistry of the blood. As she turned the pages, the scale of what she was holding began to settle in her chest like a stone. These weren't patient charts. They were records of a breakthrough. Dr. Thorne had been documenting a treatment for advanced respiratory scarring, the very thing the sanatorium had been built to treat. She read the data from the final months of 1974. The recovery rates were impossible. Patients who had been unable to walk across a room were shown climbing the stairs to the moor. The last entry was dated November 12th. It was a single paragraph written in a hurried, frantic hand. The board has ordered the immediate closure of Street Jude's. They claim the funding has evaporated. They told me to incinerate the records. I cannot destroy the work. I am sealing the vault. If anyone finds this, look for the woman who carries the seal. She will know what to do with the truth. Elena read the paragraph 3 times. Her vision blurred. She looked at the silver pillbox. Her mentor had given it to her in nursing school. Her mentor had been Dr. Thorne's head nurse. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. Julian hadn't given her a ruin. The universe had given her a mission. She turned to the back of the journal. Tucked into a silk pocket was a set of vacuum-sealed glass vials. They were filled with a clear, stable liquid. They were the original samples of the Thorne serum. Below the vials were the complete chemical formulas and the notarized signatures of the witnesses. Elena touched the glass of the vials. She thought about her own lungs. She thought about the thousands of people in the city who were told their breath was a finite resource. She thought about Julian. He had tried to bury her in a place where no one would hear her scream. He didn't realize he had buried her in a library of miracles. She leaned her forehead against the cool leather of the journal. She didn't cry. She sat in the absolute stillness of the vault and listened to the sound of her own heart. It was loud. It was steady. It was the only thing that mattered. She reached out and closed her hand over the silver pillbox and the leather book. She wasn't alone anymore. The morning light came through the east windows in long, dusty bands that turned the grit on the floor to gold. Elena did not stay in the chair. She spent the first 4 hours of the day hauling water from the pump to the dispensary vault. She found a bucket of old linseed oil and a stack of moth-eaten wool blankets in the laundry downstairs. She knelt on the stone and began to scrub the lead-lined shelves. Her knees throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, but she did not stop. She wiped away 50 years of grey silt until the dark oak began to shine. She organized the amber bottles by size. She placed the leather journal in the center of the desk next to her silver pillbox. The room no longer smelled of rot. It smelled of oil and old paper and the particular sharp scent of a space that is being watched over. She had a roll of heavy industrial plastic and a staple gun in the back of Arthur's truck that afternoon. He didn't ask what she was doing in the sealed wing. He just handed her a box of galvanized staples and a pair of thick leather work gloves. Elena climbed a step stool she had salvaged from the kitchen. She stretched the plastic across the shattered window frames of the office and the vault. She hammered the staples in with rhythmic, deliberate strikes. The plastic went taut. The screaming whistle of the moor wind was suddenly muffled. The temperature in the room rose by 5 degrees. It was the first time she had felt the air go still since she arrived. She moved her sleeping mat from the floor to a narrow iron cot she dragged from the nurses' quarters. She scrubbed the rust from the frame with a wire brush until her knuckles bled into the metal. She found a heavy wool rug in the upstairs sitting room that the moths had ignored. She spent 3 hours beating the dust out of it against the stone archway of the entrance. When she laid it down in the dispensary, the room felt grounded. She wasn't camping in a ruin anymore. She was inhabiting a station. She used the last of her bread and the small tin of heather salve to keep her hands moving. The $16.62 remained in her pocket. She had not spent a penny. Arthur arrived the following Tuesday with a crate of old glass panes he had salvaged from a greenhouse in the valley. He spent the day showing Elena how to use a diamond-tipped cutter. They worked in silence. She measured the frames of the dispensary windows, and he cut the glass. She applied the putty with a small knife she had sharpened on a stone. By sunset, the plastic was gone. Real glass sat in the frames. The moor looked different through the clear panes. It looked like a view instead of a threat. Elena watched the purple shadows stretch across the heather. She felt the steady, low-frequency hum of the building around her. The walls were no longer cold to the touch. She spent the nights by the fire, reading the Thorn journals. She used a magnifying glass she found in a desk drawer to study the chemical notations. She began to map out the supplies she would need to verify the serum's stability. She found a set of brass scales in a velvet-lined box under the floorboards. She polished the weights until they gleamed like new coins. She placed them on the desk in a neat row. Every object had a place. Every shelf had a purpose. The transformation was slow and physical. It was written in the calluses on her palms and the way she no longer leaned on the broom handle when she walked across the foyer. The west wing remained a hollowed-out shell, but the dispensary was a fortress. She had scraped the grime from the stone angel above the door. She had cleared the vines from the windows so the light could reach the floor. The building looked as if it were waking up from a long, feverish sleep. Elena sat at the desk and looked at the silver pillbox. The caduceus seemed to vibrate in the low light of the fire. She reached out and touched the lid. Her hands were scarred and the fingernails were worn down. To the quick, but they were steady. She was 66 years old and she had rebuilt a laboratory with her bare hands and a pile of discarded glass. The afternoon sun hit the amber bottles on the shelves. The room glowed with a deep, medicinal amber light. The air was clean. The silence was no longer empty. It was the silence of a room waiting for the first patient. Elena stood up and walked to the window. She saw Arthur's truck moving slowly down the track toward the crossroads. She saw the mist beginning to roll off the high ridges. She didn't feel the damp in her lungs. She felt the floor beneath her feet. It was solid. Elena stood at the workbench and sorted the glass slides by the light of a single kerosene lamp. She found a gold band in the bottom of her velvet jewelry roll while she was looking for a measuring tape. It was the ring Julian had given her 32 years ago in a cathedral filled with lilies. She did not throw it against the wall. She did not flush it away. She walked to the shelf and dropped the gold band into a glass jar filled with rusted brass screws. It made a small, hollow clink. It was just yellow metal now. It had no more power than a discarded washer. She looked at her hands in the reflection of the window. The tremors from the chemotherapy had faded into a steady, quiet strength. Her grip was firm and the skin on her palms was as tough as the leather of the journals. She spoke to the empty room, looking toward the shadow of the desk where Dr. Thorne had sat. "The air is clear today, Aris," she whispered. "The seals are holding. We are ready to begin." The first visitor arrived on a damp Wednesday morning. Arthur did not come alone this time. He brought a woman named Sarah from the crossroads. Sarah carried a 4-year-old boy whose chest made a sound like dry leaves. They did not ask to see her credentials. They did not ask why she was living in a ruin. The stories had already moved through the general store and the post office. They had heard about the nurse with the silver box. Elena did not charge them money. She looked at her $16.62 and realized it was a relic from a different life. She placed the boy on the oak desk in the dispensary. She used her old stethoscope. She did not feel the exhaustion of her own recovery. She felt the cool, professional distance of a woman who knows exactly what to do. She used the knowledge from the 1974 journals to mix a simple vapor treatment. A week later, the boy was running circles around the stone angel in the foyer. Word began to travel faster than the mist. The schoolteacher arrived with chronic bronchitis that had lasted 3 years. The baker came with lungs scarred. They did not come with insurance forms or legal documents. They brought 24 brown eggs. They brought a gallon of fresh milk. They brought 3 cords of seasoned birch and a heavy wool blanket for the cot. Elena did not look like a patient anymore. She sat at the head of the long oak table in the dining hall while the townspeople worked on the roof of the west wing. She taught Sarah how to read a pulse. She showed the local mechanic how to clean a wound using the iron-rich spring water and the heather tonic. They did not look at her with forced pity. They looked at her with respect of people who understand value. She spent her afternoons in the garden. She cleared the dead vines from the stone walls until the original shape of the sanatorium emerged. She found a patch of wild lavender and peppermint near the south fence. The physical labor was a different kind of medicine. Her muscles grew lean and hard. Her breath became deep and easy. She stopped thinking about the hallway. She stopped wondering if Julian had sold the house. The community did not arrive with a plan. It formed organically around the necessity of the work. By the end of the month, 3 of the upper rooms had been scrubbed clean and fitted with fresh linens. The kitchen was stocked. The sanatorium was no longer a hollowed-out shell. It was a functioning station of care. Elena stood on the rise of the moor as the sun began to set. She saw the smoke rising from the chimneys. She was still here. The sound of a luxury engine disturbed the silence of the moor on a Tuesday afternoon. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, bounced over the ruts of the track and stopped near the stone archway. Julian Vance stepped out of the car. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's remaining $16. He looked at the repaired windows and the smoke rising from the chimneys with a tight, calculating smile. He did not look at the heather. He looked at the structural integrity of the granite. He walked into the foyer as if he still held the keys. He found Elena in the dispensary, labeling a new batch of heather salve. She did not stand up. She did not stop her work. She looked at him with the same clinical neutrality she used for a patient's chart. Julian stopped at the edge of the oak desk. He adjusted his silk tie and cleared his throat. "Elena," he said. His voice was warm and practiced. "We've been so worried about you. The children and I haven't slept, thinking of you out here in the cold." Elena placed a label on a glass jar. "The children haven't called, Julian. Neither have you." Julian waved a hand as if dismissing a minor clerical error. "We wanted to give you space to heal, but then we heard rumors. People in the city are talking about a discovery. They say you found Aris Thorne's lost records." He leaned over the desk. He smelled of expensive cologne and air-conditioned offices. "I'm just being realistic, Elena. You can't manage a medical legacy of this scale alone. At your age, the legalities will overwhelm you. I've brought a team of developers and a patent attorney. We're here to help you secure the assets." Elena looked at his hands. They were soft and manicured. They had never pumped iron-rich water or scrubbed a lead-lined shelf. "You gave me this property because you said it was a tax liability. You called it a clean break." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We didn't know the full value then. It's a family asset, really. I'm not being cruel, Elena. I'm being practical. You're getting a home and a legacy. We just need you to sign these management papers so we can protect the research from the local council." He pushed a leather folder across the desk. It was the same gesture he had used in the law office. He used the same finger to slide the paper toward her. Elena stood up. She was taller than she had been in the city. Her shoulders were square and her gaze was level. She did not touch the folder. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pillbox. She set it on top of his legal documents. The worn metal looked stronger than the leather. "You gave me this ruin because you thought I was worthless," Elena said. Her voice was quiet and heavy as the moorstone. "Because you thought I was a ruin. You were wrong about both." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. "The Thorn journals are already in the hands of the University Medical Board. The property has been deeded to a local trust. You have no standing here, Julian. You didn't leave me a retreat. You left me a fortress." She picked up the silver pillbox and put it back in her pocket. "The car is still running. I suggest you get back to the city before the mist settles on the road. It's very easy to get lost out here when you don't know the terrain." Julian looked at the amber bottles on the shelves. He looked at the woman who was no longer his manager. He saw the scars on her hands and the light in her eyes. He realized there was no leverage left. He picked up his folder and walked toward the door. He did not look back at the stone angel. The door clicked shut behind him. 1 year after the morning she arrived at Blackwood Cross, the heather was a sea of vibrant, living purple. The stone angel above the main entrance had been cleaned of its soot. A wreath of fresh lavender sat around its base. Elena stood on the stone terrace and watched a group of university students unload crates of modern lab equipment from a van. They moved with the same energy she had once brought to the surgical wards 30 years ago. The west wing was no longer a hollowed-out shell. The roof had been replaced with slate that matched the original design. The windows were all filled with clear, thick glass that reflected the shifting clouds of the moor. Elena wore a clean white lab coat over her heavy wool cardigan. Her hands were still calloused and her skin was tanned by the high-altitude sun, but her movements were fluid. She no longer used a broom handle to walk. She spent her mornings in the newly renovated dispensary, overseeing the clinical application of the Thorn protocols. The university had named her the Director of Research Emerita. They had provided the funding to turn St. Jude's into a permanent institute. Sarah was now a head technician. Arthur had been hired as the estate manager. He sat on the porch of a new stone cottage near the south fence and smoked a pipe in the evening light. The daily rhythm of the sanatorium was a symphony of purposeful sound. There was the clinking of glass vials in the lab. There was the low murmur of patients walking the garden paths to strengthen their lungs. There was the sound of the iron pump, now motorized, drawing the mineral-rich water from the deep spring. Elena walked through the foyer. She stopped at the bottom of the marble staircase and looked at the banister. It had been restored to its original wrought-iron beauty. The building felt warm. The smell of wood smoke was gone, replaced by the scent of pine needles and clean linen. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pillbox. She turned it over in her palm. The engraved caduceus was bright and sharp. She had used a polishing cloth to remove the last of the city grime. Inside the box was no longer empty. It held a single, vacuum-sealed vial of the refined serum. It was her copy of the truth she had found behind the iron door. She walked to the window and looked out at the vast, open horizon. She thought about the woman who had sat on a suitcase in a dark storage unit. She thought about the $48.62. That woman felt like a character in a book she had finished reading. She looked toward the high ridges where the mist was beginning to gather. "We kept the light on, Aris," she whispered. The wind caught her words and carried them out over the heather. She turned back to the room. The students were waiting for her to begin the morning briefing. She did not look at the clock. She did not check a phone for messages. She simply walked toward the light. She was home. Elena Vance's journey proves that the world's definition of finished is often just a lack of imagination. A woman who was discarded like a broken tool became the architect of a new era of healing. She showed us that the sacrifices of the past are never truly lost. They are simply the currency we use to buy our own freedom when the time is right. The moor was not a graveyard for her life. It was the only place large enough to hold the woman she was always meant to become. If Elena's story moved you, if you've ever felt like the decades you gave to your family were treated like a debt instead of a gift, this story was for you. Leave one word in the comments describing how you felt when Elena looked at her ex-husband and realized she finally had everything she ever needed. Because Elena's story proves something that is always true. Your value is not determined by the people who no longer have a use for you. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest contribution might still be hidden behind a wall they haven't had the strength to break through yet. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.